Freedom now! Free Mandela!
He entered prison as a young man, condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. For nearly 3 decades, the world knew him only as a number, locked away on a lonely island. Yet when the gates finally opened, he walked out not broken, but stronger, ready to lead his people into freedom. This is the story of Nelson Mandela, the prisoner who became president. He was born into a world that told him he was less. A world where laws were written to divide, where signs on benches and buses declared who belonged and who did not. Nelson Mandela grew up in the rolling hills of Kunu, a boy who herded cattle and listened to elders speak of warriors who had once defended their land. Those stories planted seeds in him, seeds of courage, of justice, of a belief that dignity was not a gift from rulers but a right of every human being. As he grew, Mandela's path carried him from the quiet rhythms of village life to the bustling streets of Johannesburg. There, he studied law, determined to defend those crushed under the weight of apartheid. He wore suits, carried books, and spoke in courtrooms where the voices of the oppressed were rarely heard. He became not just a lawyer, but a symbol, a man who believed that words could be weapons, that justice could be argued into existence. But the government saw him differently. To them, he was dangerous. His speeches stirred crowds, his presence inspired hope, and hope was something apartheid could not afford. Police followed him, banned his meetings, and tried to silence his voice. Yet Mandela did not stop. He joined the African National Congress, stood in marches, organized strikes, and spoke of a South Africa where all races could live together in equality. The struggle was not easy. Peaceful protests were met with batons and bullets. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed, lives lost. Mandela and his comrades faced a choice: continue with peaceful resistance that was crushed again and again, or take up stronger measures. They chose to fight back, not with hatred, but with determination. They formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, a movement that sought to challenge apartheid's power directly. Mandela's words echoed across the land. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. He knew the risks. He knew the government would come for him. And in 1962, they did. Arrested, tried, and sentenced, Mandela stood before the court and declared, I am prepared to die. It was not bravado. It was conviction. He believed so deeply in freedom that even death seemed a fair price. The world listened. Newspapers carried his words. Protesters shouted his name. And yet, the iron door closed, and Mandela was led away to a cell that would hold him for nearly 3 decades. The sentence was life. The place was Robben Island, a rocky outcrop in the sea, isolated and unforgiving. The ferry that carried prisoners across the waves felt less like transport and more like exile. The island was a world apart, designed to break men, to grind them down until they surrendered to despair. Mandela's cell was small, barely wide enough for a man to stretch his arms. A thin mat lay on the floor, a bucket in the corner, a barred window high above eye level. The walls were painted white, but the brightness was cruel. It reflected the sun and made the room feel like a furnace in summer, a freezer in winter. Days began early. Guards barked orders, chains rattled, and prisoners marched to the quarry. There, under the relentless sun, they broke rocks into gravel. Dust filled their lungs, burned their eyes, and coated their skin until it seemed they carried the island itself on their bodies. The work was meant to be meaningless, a punishment without purpose. But Mandela gave it meaning. He taught his comrades to endure, to see each stone as a symbol of resistance. Nights were quieter, but not easier. The silence of the cell pressed in, broken only by the sound of waves crashing against the island's cliffs. Mandela wrote letters, carefully choosing words that would pass the censors. He spoke of family, of hope, of the struggle continuing beyond the prison walls. Each letter was a lifeline, a reminder that the world outside had not forgotten him. He became a teacher in confinement. Prisoners gathered around him, listening as he explained politics, history, philosophy. He corrected their grammar, encouraged them to read, and reminded them that education was a weapon no guard could confiscate. Robben Island became a university, and Mandela was its professor. There were moments of cruelty. Guards mocked him, denied him visits, punished him for small acts of defiance. Yet Mandela never responded with hatred. He carried himself with dignity, even in chains. His calmness unsettled his captors. They expected rage, but found patience. They expected despair, but found resilience. Years passed. Seasons changed. Mandela's hair turned gray, his face lined with age. But his spirit remained steady. He learned to wait, to endure, to believe that freedom would come. And beyond the island, the world began to stir. Protests grew louder, songs of resistance spread, and Mandela's name became a rallying cry. Robben Island had tried to silence him. Instead, it amplified his voice. The years stretched on, and Mandela's prison number, 46,664, became more than a mark of confinement. It became a symbol. Across the world, people began to chant it, sing it, paint it on banners. What was meant to erase his identity instead gave him a new one, the face of resistance. By the late 1980s, apartheid was cracking. The system that had seemed immovable was now trembling under the weight of protest. Inside South Africa, students filled the streets, workers went on strike, churches rang with sermons of defiance. Outside, the world joined in. Nations imposed sanctions, refusing to trade with South Africa. Musicians wrote songs of freedom. Stadiums echoed with chants of "Free Nelson Mandela." The government could feel the pressure. The economy weakened, isolation grew, and the old order began to collapse. In secret, officials reached out to Mandela. They wanted to talk. They wanted to find a way forward. From his prison cell, Mandela began negotiations. He spoke not of revenge, but of reconciliation. He told them that South Africa's future could not be built on hatred. He insisted that freedom must come, but that freedom must be shared by all races. His words carried weight, even from behind bars. Then came the day the world had waited for. February 11th, 1990. The gates opened. Mandela walked out, tall and calm, his fist raised in triumph. The crowd erupted, a sea of faces, tears, cheers, flags waving in the air. Some had waited their entire lives for this moment. Mandela's first speech was not fiery. It was steady, measured, filled with dignity. He said, "I stand before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people." He spoke of peace, of unity, of the long road still ahead. The prisoner had become free. But more than that, he had become the hope of a nation. 1994. South Africa stood at the edge of history. For the first time, Millions of people who had been denied the right to vote lined up at polling stations. The queues stretched for miles, men and women in their best clothes, children clinging to their parents, elders leaning on canes but refusing to miss the moment. Some waited for hours under the sun, but no one complained. Each ballot was more than a vote. It was a declaration that apartheid was ending, that dignity was being restored. When the results were announced, the impossible had become reality. Nelson Mandela, once prisoner 46664, was now the president of South Africa. The inauguration was a scene the world had never witnessed before. Leaders from across the globe gathered, and South Africans of every race stood together, cheering, crying, singing. The air carried both relief and anticipation. Mandela's first act as president was not to punish, but to heal. He spoke of reconciliation, of building a nation where former enemies could live side by side. He understood that revenge would only continue the cycle of hate. Instead, he offered forgiveness as the foundation of the new South Africa. He made symbolic gestures that carried enormous weight. One of the most famous came during the Rugby World Cup in 1995. Rugby had long been seen as a sport of the white minority, a symbol of apartheid. But Mandela appeared at the final match wearing the green jersey of the Springboks. The crowd erupted, black and white South Africans cheering together, united for the first time under a shared symbol. It was more than sport, it was a vision of what the country could become. Mandela's presidency was not easy. The wounds of apartheid ran deep. Poverty, inequality, and mistrust lingered. But he worked tirelessly, promoting education, encouraging dialogue, and reminding his people that democracy was not just about voting, it was about living together with respect. He carried himself with humility. He refused to be treated like a king. He insisted on being seen as a servant of the people. His smile, his calm voice, his steady presence became the anchor of a nation learning to walk in freedom. South Africa was free, but freedom carried scars. The wounds of apartheid were deep, families broken, lives lost, memories heavy with pain. Mandela understood that a new nation could not be built on silence. The truth had to be spoken, even if it hurt. So he created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In halls and meeting rooms across the country, victims came forward to tell their stories. Mothers spoke of sons who never returned. Fathers described nights of fear when the knock on the door meant disappearance. Survivors recounted torture, humiliation, years stolen from their lives. And across from them sat those who had carried out the crimes, policemen, soldiers, officials. They confessed, sometimes with trembling voices, sometimes with cold detachment. They admitted to beatings, killings, cover UPS. The air in those rooms was heavy, filled with grief and anger. Yet Mandela insisted that this process was necessary. Without truth, there could be no healing. Without reconciliation, there could be no future. It was not easy. Many South Africans wanted revenge. They wanted punishment, trials, sentences. Mandela listened, but he reminded them, forgiveness liberates the soul. It removes fear. That is why it is such a powerful weapon. He believed that forgiveness was not weakness, but strength, the strength to break the cycle of hate. The world watched in awe. Nations that had known civil war, oppression, and division looked to South Africa as an example. Mandela became more than a president. He became a global symbol of peace. He traveled across continents, speaking of justice, equality, and compassion. He received the Nobel Peace Prize, not for ending apartheid alone, but for showing the world that reconciliation was possible. Even after stepping down from the presidency, Mandela continued his work. He fought for education, believing that children were the key to the future. He campaigned against poverty and disease, especially HIV/AIDS, which ravaged communities across Africa. His voice, though older and softer, still carried authority. People listened because they knew he spoke from experience, from sacrifice, from a life lived in service. Mandela's legacy was not built on monuments or statues, though many were raised in his honor. It was built on the idea that forgiveness could heal a nation, that dignity could be restored, that humanity could rise above cruelty. His story became a lesson taught in schools, a chapter in history books, a name spoken with respect in every language. Nelson Mandela's journey was not just the story of one man. It was the story of a nation learning to breathe again after decades of suffocation. It was the story of millions who had been told they were invisible, finally stepping into the light. Mandela had entered prison as a young man, condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He walked out nearly 3 decades later, older, grayer, but unbroken. And instead of carrying bitterness, he carried forgiveness. That choice, simple, human, extraordinary, became the foundation of South Africa's rebirth. He showed the world that strength is not measured in revenge, but in restraint. That courage is not the loud shout of anger, but the steady voice of reconciliation. That leadership is not about power, but about service. Mandela's life reminds us that even in the darkest places, a cell, a quarry, a nation divided, hope can survive. And when hope survives, it can grow into freedom. His legacy is not only in the laws that changed or the elections that were held, but in the spirit of forgiveness that continues to inspire people across the world. The prisoner became president. The man who was silenced became the voice of a nation. And the leader who could have chosen vengeance chose instead to heal. Mandela's story ends not with chains, but with open hands. Not with walls, but with bridges. Not with despair, but with hope. Mandela's life was proof that forgiveness can heal, that resilience can endure, and that hope can transform nations. But his story is not meant to be admired from a distance. It is meant to be lived. So ask yourself, what will you do with your freedom? Will you choose dignity when life tries to break you? Will you choose knowledge when ignorance surrounds you? Will you choose forgiveness when anger feels easier? Mandela's journey calls us to act, in our homes, in our schools, in our communities. To stand against injustice, to build bridges where walls divide, and to carry hope into places where despair still lingers. The prisoner became president. The man who forgave became a symbol of peace. And now, his legacy waits in your hands. Carry it forward. Live it out. Be the change.